chapter 1. If you have on the church Bibles, it's on page 719, chapter 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. He carried these off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defects, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the officials to show favour and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you look worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance to what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief of his officials presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus.
Thanks for that. Why don't we pray as we spend some time with God's Word. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you speak to us. Lord, we thank you that you speak to us by the words of the Bible as they work in us by your Spirit. Lord, help us to see the world around us clearly by looking at Daniel, and Lord, help us to see ourselves clearly so that we might be your people and your will. Amen. Thank you for having me here. It's great that I really enjoy answering the question about how we're getting on in New Zealand. I gave a few details about how my family's getting on. It's a pretty natural question to ask someone who's moved to a new part of the world. If you've recently moved to Mackay, I'm sure people often ask you, how are things in Mackay? And kind of obviously, despite some ups and downs for us, things in Wellington are going great. And I think we're starting to realise that we're feeling more at home because there's less and less things where we go, that's really different. So I'm totally getting used to using my EFTPOS card to pay for even the smallest of transactions. In New Zealand, you can do that. It's a Kiwi thing. So there's one night after church where kind of about 15 of us went out to town for hot chocolates. It's kind of what you do. It's cold and windy and wet. And after we did, after we had our hot chocolates, we kind of all got up and we made an orderly line at the cash register, and each of us paid for our drink, all $4.20. With our EFTPOS card, and the guy behind the till just processed every single one of them with a smile. If the same thing happened in Sydney, where I'm from, they'd probably abuse you for trying to split the bill, and then they would refuse to process the EFTPOS transaction because it didn't meet some arbitrary minimum. Another thing we're getting used to in Wellington is that it's not a windy day unless you can't stand up. When the wind blows over 100 kilometres here, you call it a cyclone and give it a name. In Wellington, we just call it Tuesday. I'm getting used to my role as an Australian in New Zealand. I'm supposed to walk around and marvel at all the things that New Zealand has going for it, and then I'm supposed to politely nod and agree when the Kiwis tell me all the rubbish things about Australia. I've learned that sheep jokes are not okay. And I found myself turning every statement I make into a question, eh? I don't know if they do that in Queensland. It's a very Kiwi thing to do, eh? So they turn every statement they make into a question, eh? I think it's kind of a bit of a national insecurity thing going on there. They're always asking for affirmation. But these days, life in a new country or a new city, it's not too hard. Staying connected with family and friends back home, that's actually quite easy. With Skype and FaceTime, just before the service, I FaceTimed my kids before they went to bed. It's really easy to keep up with people who are in a foreign land. Facebook keeps me up with all the happenings. Jai had spied on my happenings this week via Facebook. And so we can keep in touch with all the things that we've left behind. My mum lives in France at the moment, and we had her over for dinner the other day. Because we set the computer up at the end of the table, and she sat there and she joined us for dinner. She was eating breakfast, but that's okay. I can watch Australia play cricket online. If I want, I can read the Sydney Morning Herald over my breakfast. Staying connected with home when we're away has never been so easy. But for Daniel, things were really different. He has essentially been kidnapped to go and work in a foreign country. And staying connected at home for him is a significantly different task. Well, for one, his home is actually no more. His country is completely destroyed, it's annihilated, it's history. There's no Jerusalem Morning Herald for him to read on his iPad over his morning coffee. There is no Skype, there is no FaceTime, there is no phone calls, and even if there was, there's no one to talk to at the other end. What happened was after a few years of uneasy peace with the world's superpower, where God's people they just towed the line, eventually they sent a big get stuffed to the Babylonians. They refused to play ball, and the result was in verse 1. Verse 1 says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God, and he carried them off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God." And that was it, gone. Judah was wiped off the map, and it wouldn't be for another 2,500 years before there would be even anything that resembled the sovereign nation on that land that had been there before. And Judah, it didn't just crumble, get old and decay. Judah, its heart was ripped out. The temple was gone, the national treasures were gone, the leaders were gone, the people were gone. You see, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, he wasn't content with just taking a few items of gold from the temple. He wanted hearts and minds as well. You see, the Babylonians, they were experts at conquering other nations. They perfected the strategy, and it was very simple but very clever. It was assimilation, not decapitation. That was their strategy. It was assimilation, not decapitation. What they did was they took anyone who was anyone, the young and up-and-comers, they took them, and rather than off with their heads, they took them back to Babylon and they brainwashed them. They captured them and they took them back to Babylon and set about making them Babylonians. They put them in the service of the Babylonian Empire. They just quietly absorbed them into Babylonian life, eroding any sense of identity they had from their home. Take a look at verse 3. "The king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians." Here we have the Babylonian strategy. 4 rising stars from Judah, Daniel and his mates, with new Babylonian names, your shack, my shack, and a bungalow. These 4 up-and-comers, their past, it was filled with disappointment, and now they've got this opportunity for a bright future as the rising stars of the Babylonian public service. If only they conform. If only they toe the party line. If only they leave the past behind and get on with being Babylonians. And here we have two massive questions that Daniel chapter 1 addresses for us. The first question is, what do we do when it looks like God has lost? What do we do when it looks like God has lost? And the second is, what do we do when the world around us pressures us to conform, pressures us to fit in, pressures us to become one of them? I mean, really, Daniel chapter 1, it answers these questions by showing us how to look at our world, how to look at our world and how to look at ourselves. Or as one commentator puts it, how to read the paper and how to look in the mirror. Daniel chapter 1 teaches us how to read the paper and how to look in the mirror. So how do we look at the world? What is God doing even when we can't see much happening? Well, Daniel chapter 1, it seems like, really, if you read it, it seems like God has left the building, doesn't it? The whole story begins with the pagan Babylonian king turning up and laying waste to who? To God's king. The enemy of God's people has come and taken a victory over God's people. A victory that kind of really is actually kind of never really reversed. It's a massive victory that will never be undone. And then there's the personal level, the kind of re-education of Daniel and his friends that's going on full steam ahead. The Babylonians gave them these new names. And these new names that they have, they no longer speak of their old God like their old names did. These new names speak of Babylonian gods. They're enrolled at the University of Babylon for their education, and they can see a secure life in the Babylonian public service rolling out ahead of them as they enjoy the benefits of living in the king's palace. It's most likely that even these boys taken to Babylon have even had their gender removed. The rules were that only eunuchs could serve in the Babylonian court. Their language, their names, their culture, even their gender has been erased by the Babylonians. And where is God at work in all of this? I mean, at the end of the program, the boys, they're standouts. They come through with flying colours. It looks like their Babylonian indoctrination has been complete. Daniel does so well that he remains in the Babylonian public service for almost 70 years, lasting all the way through 7 other kings, all the way to the reign of King Cyrus. But through this time, rather than being transformed into a Babylonian, Daniel never leaves his God behind, because Daniel knows how to read the newspaper. Daniel knows how to look at this world and see what is really going on. See, as it turns out that as the book goes on, Daniel is kind of shown to be God's undercover agent at the heart of the Babylonian Empire. Even though Nebuchadnezzar has set about to destroy the people of God through force and through assimilation, God has actually worked to have men on the inside. You see, Daniel, he survives pretty much the whole exile. He stuck around till King Cyrus, through the rise and fall of these 7 other kings, right up to the point where the people of God are allowed to return to their home to rebuild their country, their city and their temple. Despite the external appearances, God is at work through it all. And we can see this because tucked away in the midst of it all, in Daniel chapter 1, almost like a footnote that runs through Daniel chapter 1, we see that God is in control. God is working quietly and subtly and relentlessly to bring about his purposes. And the way we see this in Daniel chapter 1 is these little hints that the writer keeps dropping for us. Hints that show us that we need to look beyond what we can see, beyond the superficial, and to see what's going on behind the scenes. That behind the scenes, God is in total control. From the massive kind of geopolitical shifts of the world, the rise and fall of nations, right down to the inclination of one Babylonian official's heart. God has it all in control. As we read the paper, as we look at our world, God is the one who is pulling all the strings. Take a look at verse 2. That devastating news that the king of God's people had been defeated by his enemy. Verse 2, who gave Nebuchadnezzar the victory? It says in verse 2, the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. And then in verse 9, who gave Daniel favor with the chief officials? Who made that chief official show kindness to Daniel? Well, Now God caused the chief official to show favour and compassion to Daniel. And who gave Daniel and his mates wisdom and skill that meant that they excelled and they came to the top of the class and they were placed in the important positions and they stuck around for 7 years. Verse 17, who gave Daniel that position? Through wisdom and skill? God. These 4 men, verse 17, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. You see, in this world, even as God's people appear to be defeated, as they live as captives in exile, God is at work. He is influencing, He is maneuvering, and He is making things happen for the good of His people and for the furthering of His kingdom. And so when we're tempted to think that God has left the building, that He's up stumps and moved on, that when we think that God might have lost interest in our world and us as His people, I mean, really, when was the last time you saw God's influence or God's agenda mentioned on the news? I mean, we could be easily forgiven for thinking that this country and this world is being run by the likes of Malcolm Turnbull or Barack Obama or Rupert Murdoch or, heaven forbid, Donald Trump. But don't be fooled. God is still at work. God is still controlled. God is still sovereign over it all. And really, kind of the same way that no one probably gave a second thought to a few Jewish boys being given a job in the Babylonian public service, only for Daniel to outlive exile and return and oversee the return from captivity. In the same way, the birth of an illegitimate baby boy to a young couple in Palestine would barely have rated a mention at the time. God was at work in that, for that child was Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the one who would lay down His life, the one who would defeat sin and death and the devil. God is at work in it all. And that was then, but even now, right now amongst us, God is at work. He is at work in the apparently insignificant details of our ordinary lives, and He's working to advance His agenda and to build His kingdom. And I think the reason why we can't see it all the time is because we don't actually see the full picture. We can't see how significant what is happening right here and right now is. I mean, at the moment, there are people out the back who are giving up their time in adult church to look after children and to tell them about Jesus. And that might seem pretty small fry and pretty fringe and pretty insignificant, but who knows what God will do through one of those children? Or even church planting like this, like what I'm doing in Wellington. Our church planters were always tempted to paint things as much more impressive and much more significant than they really are, because people don't get too excited about 2 families meeting in the living room like lots of church plants start. But we don't know how God is going to use this to do great things for His kingdom. Church plants like Make, church plants like the church I'm a part of in Wellington. God has worked through these small and humble beginnings to do great things for His people and for His kingdom. He has moved and worked, and His word has not come back empty, but borne great fruit. You see, Daniel chapter 1, it teaches us that God is at work through even insignificant events to bring about major changes in our world. And even when He can't be seen, we need to remember that God is in control. He is the one who is in the driver's seat. And so remember, as you turn the TV news on tonight, when you pick up your paper in the morning tomorrow, if you feel the whole tide of this world is running against God and His people, remember this. You may not be able to see it, but God is at work. That's how we need to look at our world. We need to look at our world and remember that God is still at work to bring about His plans and His purposes. And now it's time to zoom in. That's kind of the Google Earth view, and it's time to get down on the ground level and get the Google Street view. And here's where we get to Daniel and his vegetables, right? So we've seen Daniel and his friends. They're in this terrible situation. Their country is obliterated. They're taken from their families. Their names were changed. They were forced to speak a new language. And it's as if their whole life and their whole culture and their whole identity doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. And kind of put yourself in their shoes. I've got a few slides here, but I don't have the little clicker guy. So I've got it. Much funnier with slides. yourself in their shoes. Imagine that you kind of go to sleep tonight and you kind of wake up tomorrow morning with the amazing surprise that New Zealand has managed to catch Australia by surprise and has invaded and taken over the whole country. And so they send their navy. There we go. There's their navy. It's not much different to that. They send their fighter jet and they send their tank and they invade. And they take over, and they cart us all off on the next Air New Zealand flight back to Wellington. And as Australia, the country we know, humanly speaking, it's wiped off the map. Humanly speaking, there's no hope of you ever returning back to the place that you call home. And you're taken to the thriving city of Wellington, the capital of those shaky isles, the home of cafes and craft beer and Flight of the Conchords, and you're surrounded by the bright lights and the wealth and the culture of your new home. And then they give you a name. Hey, bro. And they give you a new way of speaking. And if you speak like an Australian, you're going to be regarded as backwards and unsophisticated. They're offering you a bright new future, a new start, a leg up, a good government job with all the perks if you just take on this new identity. And don't look back. And for Daniel and his mates, that's the situation they find themselves in. The Babylonians, they're offering them this new hope. If you just conform, if you just become a Babylonian, if you just try and fit in here, we can give you a future. You can have a fresh start, a new life, a life without your God. So what does Daniel do? Well, what would you do? What do you do? Even if the idea of New Zealand taking over Australia is a little bit absurd, the situation that Daniel finds himself in is pretty similar to the situation that we find ourselves in every single day. Even life here in Mackay. How many of you actually grew up in Mackay? This is where you were born and raised and went to school. 1, 2, not many. It's very similar to Wellington, right? So heaps of you have moved to Mackay in the last year, 5 years, 10 years. And you come to a new town, and you have new opportunities presented before you. Opportunities for money and success and for pleasure and for relationships and experimenting. Opportunities to leave your old history behind and carve out a new identity where no one knows your backstory. A new identity that's different to your hometown, different to your home church. And the pressure you feel to fit in is real. It's real. You see, the book of Daniel, it was written to help people thrive in a hostile and seductive world. It's where God seems to have vanished and God's people are feeling the pressure to fit in, where they're being seduced to fit in, where they're being ridiculed if they don't fit in. And so in Babylon, even though King Nebuchadnezzar was the most powerful man in the world, he could change their names, he could change their language, he could change their education. In fact, he was even able to erase their gender. He could not change their identity. You could take these boys out of Judah, but you couldn't take Judah out of these boys because these guys knew who they were. That's to say, they knew how to look in the mirror, which is why Daniel makes such a fuss about these vegetables. Now take a look at verse 8 with me. It's great if you have your Bible. Take a look at verse 8. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. That's a bit strange. What is it with this royal food and wine? Why won't Daniel touch this royal food and wine? Some people think it was the food offered to idols. And so Daniel didn't want to eat food that's offered to idols, but that would make sense because all the food would have been offered to idols, including the vegetables, but yet he's still happy to eat those. Was it because the food wasn't kosher, it didn't meet the Jewish food laws? Were they offering kind of bacon double cheeseburger like hamburgers, and he's like, kind of can't eat bacon? Well, the wine would have been okay. He could have drunk the wine, but he doesn't drink the wine. Was it because he shouldn't eat meat? Was God offering a new kind of diet fad for his people? At this point, we've got quite a lot of South Africans in our church. At this point, some got quite stressed because the thought of going 30 minutes without a large hunk of meat is an abomination for them. But it wasn't that. It wasn't some new diet that God was kind of giving his people that were then to replicate thousands of years later because we've discovered some hidden health benefits in it, like some sort of biblical caveman diet. It's none of those. The only thing we're told is that for Daniel, this was a private and a personal decision that he made. A decision that Daniel made that he would not defile himself. It wasn't a massive statement to the world. It was something that Daniel was doing for himself before God. And I think he was doing it for the sake of his identity. He was doing it as a daily reminder to himself of who he really was, of where his strength and where his success really came from. Daniel was saying to himself at each and every meal, I do not belong to Babylon. I belong to the living God. You see, everything in his world, it had been telling him to simply just roll over, Daniel, become a Babylonian. Every class he went to, every day of work, every time they called out his name, every meal he ate was screaming, you're one of us. You're one of us. But Daniel, in that situation, through his choice to eat the veggies and forgo the king's rich food, he was quietly saying to himself, no, I'm not one of you. I do not belong to Babylon. I belong to the living God. You can seduce me with all your wealth and your opportunities and your education and your rich food, but you do not own me. I belong to God. And it's important to say there's nothing actually wrong with the meat and the wine. It's just Daniel needed a way to say to himself every day, Babylon is not my home, but I belong to God. Are you there? Have you got that? It's not about the vegetables. It's about identity. It's not about a new diet. It's about saying each and every day that I belong to God. It's about looking in the mirror and remembering who you are and who you belong to. I was a teenager in the 90s, and so we've got some younger people at church, and I feel like it's my moral responsibility to educate them of the pop culture they've been deprived of. I feel like movies are getting more and more rubbish. Maybe I'm becoming a grumpy old man. Movies are pretty rubbish these days. Every movie seems to be another remake of a movie that was made before, or a remake of a superhero movie, and they've run out of villains, so much so that the superheroes are fighting against each other now. But at this point, I feel like I should inform you of that deeply moving and profound and thoughtful movie called Cool Runnings from the early 90s. If you've seen the movie, you know it's about the Jamaican bobsled team who make the Winter Olympics in Calgary in Canada. And there's one guy on the team, Junior. He's kind of a rich kid, but he kind of lives under his dad's thumb. He's kind of a bit too soft, a bit too timid. And kind of the night before the big race, his dad calls him up and says, you're being stupid, you need to come home. And he's about to go home, and it's going to ruin it for the whole team. And his mate Yule takes him from the bar that they're in where they're being picked on by the Swiss bobsled team. And he takes him into the bathroom and he kind of stands him in front of the mirror and says, Junior, look in the mirror and tell me what you see. And Junior begins all timid and says he can only see himself. I can just see Junior. But Yule isn't satisfied. He says, you see Junior? Well, let me tell you what I see. I see pride. I see power. I see a badass who won't take no crap off of nobody. Pardon the language. But he can see his potential. He can see who he really is. He can see not who he's being told to be, but who he really is. And if I was to drag you in front of the mirror and ask you, tell me what you see. If you stand in front of the mirror, tell me what you see. What would you say? Who are you? How would you define yourself? I mean, there's lots of ways we can define ourselves. We could go our nationality or our career, or the most common way we define ourselves is our relationships. So I can look in the mirror and I can say, there's Andrew the Australian, or Andrew the husband of Adele, or Andrew the father of Isaac, Lucy and Finn, or Andrew the pastor. And we do this all the time. We see ourselves, our identity, based on what we do or based on who we're related to. But each time we do this, we're digging ourselves into a hole. I mean, if our identity is based on our nationality, it's really just an accident of geography and birth and timing. If our identity is found in our jobs, we're just storing up problems for the day when we can't work or we lose our jobs, like lots of people here have found. If our identity is based on our relationships and our security comes from being our father's son or daughter, or being married to this particular person, or being the parents of these particular children, that too is a risky game. Because there'll be a day when our relationships will end, or change, or break. And then what will we be left with? And it's actually an unfair burden to place on a relationship, to find your identity in that relationship. You see, this is a core human question. Who are you? The Bible teaches us, however we answer that question, I'm a Queenslander, I'm a good neighbour, I'm a mother, I'm a musician, I'm a sporty person, I'm a hard worker, I'm a church planter, I'm a Bible study group leader, I'm a student, The Bible says, however we fill in that statement, however we fill in that blank, unless we answer, I'm a child of God, I belong to Jesus, then our security and our sense of significance, they're going to be profoundly fragile. They're just never going to be able to deliver for us. So who am I? Who are you? You belong to the Lord Jesus. Because the answer to that question is more significant, way more significant than where you were born, or who you're married to, or who else is in your family, or whether you've got a job that can pay the mortgage. If you can look in the mirror and you know that you belong to the Lord Jesus, that is where your identity needs to lie. And if that is where your identity lies, then do you have some markers in your life each and every day that help remind you that Jesus is your Lord and that this place is not your home? What are the things that others will look at your life and they'll notice your priorities are different? That you have not conformed to this world. Like Daniel's diet, what do you do to remind yourself constantly that you belong to God? For those of us who are married, some of us will wear a wedding ring. I did this talk once and forgot my ring, and it was a little bit awkward, but I've got mine on today. We wear a wedding ring, and it's a reminder of the promises we've made to our spouse. But as people who belong to Jesus living in this world, we need the same kind of reminders built into our day and our week to remind us that we do not belong to this world and that we belong to Jesus. Like Daniel's veggies, we need things that are constantly reminding us that we are one of God's people. I mean, I think the first and foremost and best is a daily commitment to reading God's Word. Maybe it's a deliberate decision to disengage from something at work that you find is not helpful for you as a Christian, whether it be the after-work drinks or the morning tea gossip. A deliberate decision to disengage from that. Maybe it's the decision to not drink alcohol or not drink as much alcohol as everyone else. Put a limit on it so that you can say a statement to yourself and to those around you that your identity is not found in that. That you don't need that to have a good time, to feel good about yourself. It's not about rules, but it's about a personal and private reminder that you are living for something, for someone else. I have a friend in Sydney. He works in a very well-paying job. He's a partner at one of the big four accounting firms in the city. He earns a lot of money and he gives a lot of it away. And he resolved that each and every week he's going to give. He does his church giving in cash. You can't even, at our church, we don't take cash giving. It all goes to the bank account. But at the church he goes to, he can do this. And so every Sunday morning on his way to church, he pulls up with his wife and his 3 kids in the car. He pulls up to the ATM, gets out, and he withdraws a considerable sum of money in cash. And he sticks it in an envelope, and then when he gets to church, he puts it in the collection plate that he goes by. And for him, it's the physical reminder of actually having to take the money out of the bank and having to hand over a big pile of cash and seeing it and feeling the value of it rather than it being kind of numbers off a bank statement. For him, this is his way that he reminds himself that he does not live for this stuff. He does not belong to this world. The money and the success that's there to be had, he's not living for it. It's not his God. He will not become a Babylonian because he belongs to the true and the living God. Now, you don't have to give money in cash and you don't have to eat vegetables, but what do you do to remind yourself that this world is not your home, but that you belong to Jesus? So Daniel chapter 1, what's it all about? It teaches us how to read the paper, how to see the world around us, and the hostility that we get at work and the constant pressure we get to get in line on certain issues, the constant struggle we have to be taken seriously when we talk about Jesus. Despite all that difficulty, God is in control. God is at work. God gave the victory to Nebuchadnezzar. He influenced the king's officials. He gave Daniel wisdom. God is in control. God is in control. So it makes sense to keep stuff. And Daniel chapter 1, it teaches us how to look in the mirror and how to see ourselves clearly. To see that we're more than the numbers at the bottom of our bank statement. We're more than the number of friends we have on Facebook. We are more than our education or our jobs or our relationships. We belong to Jesus. The Apostle Peter writes this in 1 Peter chapter 2. He writes this for God's people experienced a very similar situation to that of Daniel. He talks about them being aliens and exiles, God's people living away from God's land. He says this to them, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful light. Despite appearances, despite the darkness around us, God is in control. He has called us and chosen us out of the darkness to be His people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people who declare His praises in the darkness, the praises of His wonderful light that we find in the Lord Jesus. We pray with